Well, good morning. My watch says 9:30, so I guess it's time to begin this morning. We'll start out with a prayer, and just as you're thinking of those we need to add, I'll just glancing at the bulletin here. Need to continue to remember Sutton Kate, as she's still sick, so they've had to postpone her surgery. Also, Kathy Bates has a cousin that has surgery tomorrow due to eye cancer. His name's Tim Pinkard. And then need to remember Miss Sylvia and the passing of her brother. Also continued, I believe Sophie Williams, I'm not sure if she's still on her mission trip, but I know she was. She may be home by now, I haven't heard. Still there, so need to continue to remember her and probably her parents more so than her. And remember Sheila Shires. Mark said she's home today, not feeling well, so continue to remember her. And of course, remember Trey and Ellen and family. I see some guests here. I'm sure that's the reason they're here this morning with the birth of their new daughter, Ellie Ruth. Or no, Ellie Ruth, the sister. I'm reading and talking at the same time. Millie Evelyn Maddox. Any others that we need to remember? And we need to continue to remember Mr. Jim and Miss Betty, as they're both still recovering. All right, if there aren't any additions to that, I'll lead us in prayer, and then we'll continue our study of Moses. Dear Lord, I just want to thank you for this day you blessed us with. Thank you for allowing all of us to be here today. Dear Lord, we just pray that you especially be with those that we've mentioned, those who are sick. We pray for healing for them. Those who have upcoming surgeries, we pray for your guidance for those involved with that. And dear Lord, we pray for those who are still recovering from procedures. And also for Miss Sylvie and her family and the loss of her brother. We pray for your comfort for them. Dear Lord, we know there are others that we may have not thought of or mentioned this morning. We just pray that you would be with them as only you can. Lord, just continue to go with us through this study of Moses and be with us later as we spend time worshiping you. And just forgive us for all our many sins. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. So those who are visiting with us, we are studying Moses this quarter, and a little, I guess, bookkeeping or housekeeping before we begin. Next Sunday is the last Sunday of the quarter, but I've got about 5 lessons left. So I'm going to be out next Sunday. It's Easter Sunday, so I'm going to be out of town. But Michael Bates is going to teach the class next Sunday. But then after that, Bubba has agreed to delay starting his class till the beginning of May. So that'll allow me to finish up the lessons that I have for us. So instead of us swapping at the beginning of the quarter like we normally do, we're going to delay that till the 1st of May. So y'all be stuck with me for a few more weeks at least, and hopefully we can wrap this study up as best we can, even though there's still, you could spend a lot of time looking at Moses. As we taught last week, we completely skipped over the whole plagues and interaction with Pharaoh for the most part, but we'll do that, and today we're going to be looking at beginning, I guess, in Exodus chapter 19. We're going to cover a lot of chapters today, sort of. But before we do that, if you remember last week, we talked about Exodus chapter 18 and Jethro's visit to Moses, and we kind of talked about burnout and how especially leaders can be in danger of burnout, and really any of us when we get busy with things and kind of get, as I think we talked about, get a little tunnel vision and focused on just the task at hand and forgetting the big picture, which is sort of what was happening to Moses. And we talked about delegation and how a lot of times we don't think about, we talk a lot about, the term delegation when it comes to leadership and other things, but I don't know that we always tie together how delegation can help us avoid stress and burnout. And that's really what Jethro's advice was being given to Moses for. And we see an example of how Moses implemented that. We went through a lot of that pretty quick, and I don't want to give the false impression that burnout is an easy thing to deal with, and even that really delegation can be a challenge to really implement effectively. Because if you're like me, I tend to be more of a hands-on person, maybe somewhat of a perfectionist, so the idea of if you want something done right, do it yourself can work against delegation for sure. And I have to watch myself personally on that sort of thing. And sometimes, some people don't like you feel like you're intruding on someone if you go ask them to do something for you. And so instead of bothering them with an issue, you'll say, well, I'll just take care of it instead of worrying someone else with it. So those are all things we have to keep in mind when it comes to delegation. But as with Moses, we have to remember sometimes there's more important things we need to be doing, and we do need to get in the practice of delegating and letting others get involved. And there's all kind of other benefits with that as well, because that's, delegation can be a good way of training the next, person in line or whoever's going to take your place when you're talking about leadership structure. Any other comments on burnout and delegation before we move on to the next topic? Okay, I don't think it was an accident that, I'm going to say, God sent Jethro to see Moses. Whether God sent him or it just worked out that way, I think there's some providence there, because you see, as we talked about last week, that happened pretty early on their wilderness journey. For the most part, they had been pretty busy up to that point. They had crossed the Red Sea. They'd gotten their food situation kind of worked out, dealing with that. And they had some battles with the Amalekites. And then you had them kind of setting up camp there at Mount Sinai. And we, again, talked about Jethro helping Moses kind of basically get the judging and the organization set up. Well, Exodus chapter 19, you start a series of I guess, again, we're at Mount Sinai, and this is where Moses is going to start having, quote, meetings with God. He's going to go up to the mountain and meet with God. There's a lot of trips back and forth up and down the mountain. I'm sure Moses must have been in pretty good shape for a 80-year-old man at this point, as many trips as he had to make up and down the mountain. And really from Exodus chapter 19 to 31, maybe even, I think you can even go in a couple more chapters, but those are the main chapters where Moses is going up and he's receiving the law. He's receiving instructions on how to set up worship. So you had Exodus chapter 18 where Jethro is helping Moses kind of get the structure set up. But in 19 is when God's giving Moses instruction on how to worship, going to receive the law and those sorts of things. So a lot of logistics, I guess you could say, but a lot of detail as well. So we're not going to be able to go through those chapters verse by verse, but I definitely encourage you to read those, because even though you can get bogged down with the laws and things like that, there's a lot of things you can gather from a big picture standpoint. But kind of one thing we're going to focus on today is just Moses meeting God in the sense of spending time close with him and that sort of thing. And before we get into that, if you will, turn to Joshua chapter 5. I wanted to read, we're going to look at Moses for sure, but just with the thought of how people react when they meet God, we're going to look at just a couple of other examples before we look at Moses. So Joshua chapter 5, verse 14. If you go back to verse 13, it says, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went and said to him, are you for us, or are you our adversary? And he said, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. All right, now let's look at Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Isaiah 6, 1 through 5. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim, each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to the other and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. So in those 2 instances, what kind of response do you see when people in the Bible actually met God, or God's spokesman is in Joshua, I guess the leader of his army? Fell down and worshiped. Took their shoes off, and it's similar to what we talked about the burning bush with Moses, is it not? That was something that got Moses' attention. So you see, and I think we'll continue to see as we look further today that, whenever God or a representation or of God's presence was there, it had an effect on people. It wasn't, it was an impression on them that they probably would never forget. All right, so let's look at Exodus chapter 19, and we're going to continue that thought. Starting in verse 1, it says, on the 3rd new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the household of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you out to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasure possession among all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So this is about 3 months after they left Egypt. Do you think, and again, where are they at? Mount Sinai. Do you remember what we read? Or someone, if you want to turn back to Exodus chapter 3, verse 12. When we were talking about the burning bush, what did God tell Moses as a sign that he would worship again on this mountain? So it's kind of an interesting thought. You think about all the time, it's been 3 months. You think of all the things that have happened in those 3 months, you know, even with just, you know, the Pharaoh and all the events there, their battles with the Amalekites, the crossing of the Red Sea. I mean, any of those events is enough for a major event in your life and to fill that quota. But do you think Moses, as he's standing there at the bottom of this mountain and God's telling him, all right, come on up to the mountain with me, do you think he thought back to the burning bush and what God had told him?
You said in the beginning you didn't know if Moses' guidance to Mount Sinai, or if he guided by God, if he just went there. And I think this verse just shows that he was guided.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think God was involved with Moses' life from the day he was born and leading him to places, which I guess is a side note lesson to us, is that I'm sure Moses probably didn't always in the moment realize how involved God was in guiding him. And we, I think, can say the same things about us. Sometimes the things that are happening to us we don't understand, but a lot of times if we look hard enough, we can see that God is involved if we let him be involved.
Took Moses a pretty long time to understand that God was guiding him and he needed to do what God told him to do.
Right, I think you're right. It did take him a long time, and he never stopped learning either, I don't think. I think we'll see that in several weeks. So again, the main purpose in these early chapters, starting in chapter 19, is God's going to give the people some instructions on worship before they get into the 10 Commandments, of course, is coming in chapter 20. But I want us to look really at the worship side of things, and he's preparing them to basically meet God in a more physical sense, because God's going to come down to the mountain. But before that even happens, there's some requirements there. The first one we've already read, beginning in verse 3. What does God tell the people there? In, I guess, really around verse 5, really. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the people. So what is God requiring there? What was that? Obey my voice. Keep his commands, and those commands are coming pretty soon. And what do the people say in verse 7? You had this happen a lot. You know, Moses going to go up to the mountain, get some communication, some instruction for God, then he goes back down, delivers it to the people. And in this case, that's what he does. Moses goes down in verse 7, delivers those words to the people. And then in verse 8, it says, all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported those words to the Lord. So really the first thing that, you know, in preparation for the people to meet God, God requires their obedience. And in this case, the people confirm that they are willing to do that. So let's look in verse 9. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. So what's another, can you pick up another requirement there when it comes to meeting God? Yeah, we had to be willing to hear and listen.
And believe.
And believe, right. Yeah. All right, verse 10. When Moses told the words to the people of the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on the Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain." So Moses went down to the mountain and told the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, "Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman." So what's in verses 10 through 11, what's the next requirement? Well, there was a big word we don't use very much, or at least it's a big word for me, but what was Moses to do to the people? Consecrate, basically to cleanse. We see like, especially the priests have to do a lot of that as we get further on in, but it was a practice that they, would have to where they, their garments had certain things had to be, clean garments. And they were supposed to refrain from women for a certain time. So that's what God is telling Moses to do. So it's kind of a physical requirement. But what is it ultimately really doing? And which is, we're going to talk more as in an application to us. But is it all about the physical? It's a spiritual thing. That practice of cleansing yourself physically was a mindset and a spiritual preparation in this case, and more of a consecration of the heart, I guess you could say. And again, yes, it ties back to the obedience. It's, God's making this command, so by them doing that, it shows their obedience, that they're, again, preparing to meet God. I mean, it's, when you really think about it, it's a lot. God's giving them a 3-day warning that I'm about to come down on this mountain, and I think we're probably going to see in a little bit why that 3-day warning was given there, but there is some effort and some preparation on the people's part. Okay, so verse 12, we already read, but what is the next, what did Moses have to do as part of that in verse 12? Set boundaries. So there were limits. So, the people weren't allowed to go near the mountain, and that was for their safety. And, even animals were not allowed to go to the base of this mountain. And that's, again, goes back to some of the, take your sandals off for your own holy ground. When God touches something, it changes that thing, but just because of his presence. And even if you go down to verse 21, God comes back to Moses and says, "Go down and warn the people lest they break through to the Lord to look, and many of them perish." So it was such an important thing and significant thing that he even tells Moses to go double check. Of course, Moses says, well, there's no way people are going to get through. We've done the boundaries and everything's good. But that tells you how important it is. But again, these things that were required, willingness to obey, the willingness to hear and listen, they had to consecrate and prepare themselves both physically and spiritually. And then there's this respect. They had to respect God's presence and the significance of that, and not go near the mountain. I guess just kind of a side note to that, but who's going to end up going up the mountain? Actually, going up the mountain? Moses. So again, you see Moses is under different rules there, but as we see kind of, and I don't think the words do it justice when you read what it was like when God came down on the mountain. It shows you some bravery on Moses' part, and it gets back to what we were talking about before. He's starting to, I think, get a little bit better understanding of God and who God is, because he responds to God's presence a lot of times differently than the people do. Okay, so the meeting at the mountain, starting in verse 16, I believe it is. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. You think, after reading this, you think those boundaries had to be real robust at this point once the people saw and experienced this?
I think about Genesis, boundaries for Adam and Eve.
Right.
Satan moved the boundary line.
You're right, yeah,
Kept them moving.
that's right.
God set boundaries to protect us.
Yeah,
We kind of think like he doesn't want us to do this,
yeah,
but for protection.
you're right. And from a spiritual sense, that, when you talk about sin and boundaries, like you said, those, we're told not to do certain things. It's not because God doesn't want us to be happy or doesn't want us to be able to experience things. It's because God knows that those things aren't good for us. And just like you're saying, we tend to cross those boundaries, and we usually suffer and pay for it, but we don't recognize that a lot of times. That's a good point. Picking up in verse 18, now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And again, that's going to continue process for a while through chapters 31. In verse, I guess, 16, when you look, you think that their reaction there, it says that they trembled. Again, it's hard to read these words, and really, I don't think we really, at least I don't, have a good picture in my mind of what that sight looked like. Right, yeah. I don't think you'd have had to worry about me going and touching the mountain. That wouldn't have been a temptation for me. But yeah, even though we know the people, and I guess that's the way we are, even though they see this, it's not going to be long before they're back. I guess the everyday life gets them and distracts them, and they're back, rejecting God, not obeying Him. But in this moment, they're seeing this awesome power of God and realizing who this God is, I think. But it had to be an awesome sight. Well, yeah, I'm sure there was, like you said, there's always that one person in the crowd, isn't it? So those, again, God had Moses make sure that they weren't going to come close. So why do you think, and we'll look at some reasons why, but why do you think God chose to reveal himself to Moses and the Israelites in this way? Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a big part of it. He was. They had a lot ahead of them, and again, it's God's wisdom that we see here with Jethro and with this. You know, he's trying to get them started out in a good foundation, and he's building a nation is what he's about to go about doing. And of course, we know the stubbornness of the people. It took another 40 years for God to basically filter out to the people that would follow him, but they had a lot ahead of them, and they were going to have to be able to trust him and believe him if they were going to be successful. If you turn over probably a page or two in the next chapter, chapter 20, there in verse 18, again, there was more thunder and lightning and stuff. It says, now when all the people saw the thunder and the lightning and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off. And Moses said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Demonstration of power, yep. Yeah. Well, that's true. I'd never really thought about that. You know, like I said, we know, I mean, we see those, they're still finding those places today where these tribes from way back would build these mounds, and that's where their idols would be, in these hot places. So, yeah, the connection there with God descending on the mountain, there could have been some signal there. And then too, I guess maybe it made it a little harder for the people to get to him and kind of help protect them too as well.
So it makes me think about today, what he tries to tell us. If we obey him, we have his love and all that. But then if we don't, you see this side of him where we have eternal punishment.
Right.
So I think maybe he's trying to tell them that too in this sense, I'm this kind of God, but I'm also the loving God.
Right. Yep. Yep. Even as
Have to do something in 40 years. But just sit there and look at one another.
right, yeah, that's true. But yeah, even as parents, I guess say, is there such thing as healthy fear? Yeah, a fear of respect, and also, like you're saying, a fear of knowing that if I don't obey, then there's going to be punishment, there's going to be discipline. I mean, we can see that pretty easily with parent-child relationship. If parents don't, lay some rules in place, and we know kids, they're going to, just like us with God, they're going to test that limit, and so there comes a time where the kid has to experience and realize that the parent will carry out punishment if those rules are broken. So I think that's a lot of what God is doing here is to establish healthy fear of him. But in verse 20, what does Moses tell? What's the reason for that? We've already been talking about it. It's to keep them from what? Keep them from sin. So I think the same thing is with us. And then, of course, the next part of that, just the logistics part of it, we see if you continue on in chapter, starts in chapter 20, you know, this is where Moses is going to meet with God and get the 10 Commandments and get all the structure for priests and the structure for the other laws on top of the 10 Commandments. So there is I guess, I wouldn't say boring, but there's that side of it of just, you know, there's certain things that had to be laid out in writing, so to speak. And that's what the other purpose of God coming down on the mountain is. And again, all of that also is giving this impression on the people so that when Moses does come down from the mountain, the people are going to listen to him because they know where he's been. They've been able to hear it and see it all this time. So it does help, you know, provide some support to Moses and his authority.
God certainly got their attention from one of these things. And they'd witnessed God's power with all the plagues that happened in the
Right.
Egyptians. And it certainly got their attention. And before they talk about focusing, getting your heart right, as we talk about, I know Jim has mentioned a lot, focusing, getting our mind set on worshiping God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's
All around us, tremendous things. It certainly got their attention.
right.
We certainly need to think about it, focus, get our mind set on what's important.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's kind of where we're headed next. And again, we're just touching the surface of this. You know, you read all of these chapters, and again, we read a lot of times to study the 10 Commandments and to study the laws and stuff, and you have to read that to find the other stuff. But I would challenge you to just sometime read through these chapters and maybe don't focus so much on the thou shalt not do this, but focus on exactly the interaction with God, even though there's not a whole lot of description there. But, you know, you've got the spot that, and it'll come up a little bit later, but the part where when Moses comes down from the mountain and his face is so bright, he has to wear a veil because it scares the people. You know, we don't have a good mental picture of what that looked like, you know, but it's a lot of power and a lot of things being shown here that I think we don't comprehend. So going on what Miss Sylvia is getting into in the last few minutes we have this morning, what are some practical guidelines for us that we can glean from this? Is this the same God that we're going to be worshiping here in just a little bit? Right. And he goes through the trouble of all this trouble to set it up in the Old Testament. I mean, they had a lot of more, restriction's not the right word, but a lot more instruction and detail and things they had to do for their worship that it's not quite the same for us. And that's because, you know, our worship is more internal, more related to the heart, even though theirs was back then as well, but they did have the physical things. You know, they had the tabernacle and things like that, I guess you'd say rituals they had to do. But I do think sometimes we forget that, you know, the God that we're going to be worshiping a little bit later is the same one that, you know, that we can't comprehend the visual image of him descending on this mountain. So if we think about that and keep that in mind, how can that help us here in just a little while? Should we be prepared for worship? He requires. That's a good point. And is there an aspect of fear and respect that should be in our worship?
Also remembering we are not the audience in the worship. What's going on stage is not the
Yeah.
worship. We are the ones on the stage. He is the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. It's directed to him, not And again, with anything related to God, we get some benefit out of it, get a lot of benefit out of it, but that's not the purpose of our worship, as Johnny's saying. It's to be directed toward God. And I think, looking at this, we're studying Moses and these things that are happening here. If we can look at that, and again, you can look at the other interactions with God, and I think it does help to center us and remind us of who we are worshiping when we do come together, and will help us, because it's, as Johnny said, it's easy, for us, and sometimes it's even, I think, even more of a challenge sometimes, or can be, to those who are leading us in worship. Because a song leader, not all these song, even though we've got some really good song leaders and they do a really good job, I'm going to tell you, there's probably, some of them that get nervous about getting up there, even though they do a really good job. So it's probably difficult for them at times to focus on worship, because they're, standing up there with all of us staring at them, and they got to get their songs picked out and things like that, so it does take a lot of effort on our part to, again, be prepared. And those are things we need to make sure that we're putting in the amount of time needed, and the amount of mental focus to try to, and some of us can shut our brains off easier than others, but, not be thinking about the things that, we've got to do tomorrow, or the things we didn't get done yesterday, and those sort of things, and really focus on worshiping God as He, demands, and as He, desires, similar to the way they did back then. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
I was just thinking Israelites had just come from Egypt, and they had all how many gods, idols.
Yeah.
God was more than, like I said, himself apart from their God.
I think you're right, and I think it goes back to a little bit what Miss Sylvia was saying. They had already seen, the miracles in Egypt. I mean, the Red Sea should have been enough for anybody, to remind them. But as a people, it seems that they easily forgot. But, like you said, I do think, they were in Egypt for so long that they were, even though they believed in God, they saw that other worship, and God wasn't as present in a physical sense during those 400 years. It doesn't appear as He is now. So I do think it was some of that going on of, again, all right, I'm the true God, and this is going to really show you that I am the true God, not those gods in Egypt. And I even think at times, even though Moses seemed to respond and deal well with it and better than the people, but I think even for him, it was an experience of learning and growing for him, because, again, he was raised by the Egyptians for a big part of his life, so he was exposed to all that. And then he was in Midian, where it appears, just by some of Jethro's response when Moses met with him, he acknowledged at that point that your God is the true God. So it seems to be some indication that maybe Jethro was open to the possibility of other gods. So I think this is really solidifying it for not just the Israelites, but for Moses as well. Any other thoughts or comments? I'm going to make up for last week and give y'all a few minutes to fellowship and maybe get to the restroom, tend some other things. So again, we can maybe be better prepared for worship here in a few minutes. But thank y'all for your comments. Again, Michael's going to be teaching next week, and then I believe if I looked at my schedule right, I'll bring you some handouts for the April 7th. We're going to add a lesson in there that I wasn't able to cover in the other class to keep the flow going in the right order. So again, thank y'all for your comments this morning.